Okay.
I'm just gonna call you Jack, though.
That'd be good. That'd be good.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. If you are unaware, my name is Thomas McClinigan. I'm the Education and Outreach Manager over at the Museum of the Aleutians. Welcome to another one of our Lunch and Learn talks. This is a program, if you're unfamiliar, where basically we open the floor to any community members, any visiting researchers, visiting archaeologists. If there is a subject that you would like to talk about that is, academic or interesting, of community interest, shall we say, we are happy to host a talk for you. So we've had everything from internet privacy to health to bison to map projections, so all sorts of topics. So if you're interested, you're always free to contact me, education@aleutians.org, and we'd be happy to set you up in the future. But for right now, we have a bison talk by Jack, our visiting archaeologist. But before we begin, we'd just like to take a moment to acknowledge that the Museum of the Aleutians and all of our programming is located on the ancestral and unceded traditional territory of Unangax. And with that, I'm going to go ahead, turn it over to Jack, and we'll jump into bison.
Thank you, Drennan. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and delighted to be able to come back this year and participate in some museum and community activities. So when I was slated to show up, Jenny suggested that I would talk about bison. I think that was spurred in part by Dale Guthrie's work with Blue Babe. So we don't usually think of bison in the Arctic, but in fact, the reason there are bison in North America is they snuck through here at an opportune time, probably between 130 and 190,000 years ago. So we're in the Arctic, but we're going to talk about things further south, and we're going to see some changes, I think we could say, in the perspectives we have on bison hunting, on indigenous cultures and bison interactions, and this is more of a history of how my thinking has changed than it is a view of contemporary anthropological thought. So my background is primarily archaeology, and in the US we're trained in anthropology departments, so we're kind of indoctrinated to anthropological thought, and we come at that kind of global perspective on human variation from a perspective of prehistory and change through time. So that's kind of the angle that I operate from on a daily basis. So today we're going to talk about bison hunting, and typically, and this is from a Catlin painting in the 1830s of bison hunting in the Great Plains. And that's what we often think of when we think about indigenous people, nations in the Great Plains region, or teepee dwelling, bison hunting folks. And that's a storyline that's developed through many decades, over a century, about a century and a half almost, of anthropological thought. So we're going to talk about the plains, and we're going to talk about bison. We're going to talk about perspectives on how people and bison have interacted. I say bison and I say buffalo, and so we're talking the same thing. In Oklahoma, there are a lot of confused people. I grew up there, so I'm aware of some of them. And in Buffalo, Oklahoma, their mascot is the bison. I'm not going to go into that in any great detail, but I just wanted you to be aware that I may use these terms interchangeably. technically what we're looking at in the New World are in fact bison from a scientific perspective. So I want to talk a little about bison as a creature, critter, bison behavior and variation. Um, much of what we know about bison behavior is simply zoological observation, and then in recent decades, studies of contemporary herds. And we have a lot of information from the archaeological record, bison bone beds, where bison died either of natural causes or from hunting. So if we think in terms of seasonal cycles of bison, in most years, bison calves are born in the spring, kind of late April to early May for much of the central and northern plains area. And most calves, this is the 85% as is going to be typical of much of this talk. I'm remembering things that I haven't talked about for a decade or more. So that's a fairly close estimate of the number of calves, the proportion of calves that are born in a really brief window. And for bison, this typically is spring, late April, early May. And so the majority of calves are the same age. And so they grow up as an age group and they graze with the herd that they're in the same way. So what that enables from a paleontological and archaeological perspective is that we can sort out the bones of, say we have a bison bone bed where they were killed or died that's the size of this room and is full of bison bones. We can sort them out into age groups. You can tell by the size, but primarily teeth. So their dentition development is highly predictable, and the wear and eruption of molars and so forth is the same for each age group, and so you can literally sort them out and know how many individuals of each age group that you have in a bone bed or whatever. And this tells us something about herd history. Some years calves do very well, some years they don't. But anyway, that's an important piece of bison ecology and behavior. This is just an example of bison of different sizes. You've got young, probably 2-year-old here, yearlings, and then you would have calves. But even when they're fully grown in terms of stature, their tooth wear and abrasion and eruption sequence of the molars continues, and so you can sort out the adults as well as the young in terms of age groups. So if you're wandering around the plains with a spear or an atlatl or a piece of flint or something, 300 years ago or 500 years ago or 10,000 years ago, you could encounter a scene like this. What's interesting, and one of the key points that I want to make today, is that herds of bison like this were not common until after the Pleistocene, until after about 13,000 years ago, and by 12,000 years ago, we see increasingly large herds based on the paleontological record. So if you want to go hunt these critters, they're actually very fast, pretty agile, and can be pretty dangerous if you annoy them. So there's sort of a strategy that we believe was commonly used in persuading groups of bison to move in a particular direction. And the way I envision this is that you get your kids and obnoxious teenager types to go get robes or blankets or go build fires and just be a nuisance, and neither the bison or anybody else want to be around them, so they go in a different direction. So you can kind of passively herd these animals with, send the obnoxious people out to where you don't want the bison to go, and get them started moving in a direction that is advantageous to you as a hunter. And you can envision the high plains or the Great Plains in general as vast open grasslands, which is true, but you also have springs, drainages, rivers and streams where they will need to go every day if they have access for water and shelter from some severe storms and such. There are also playa lakes up on the high plains, but one of the strategies that was commonly used beginning at least 12,000 years ago is to get bison moving into topographically diverse settings. And this is an example of that. And so you might then get your obnoxious group up here, convince the bison that they're better off going a different direction, and they wind up in little gullies and say, if this doesn't really capture what I would like for it to, but you can have a head cut from erosion, so you have a steep bank, say at the end of this little gully. And it might only be 5 or 6 feet high. It doesn't have to be real high, it just has to be steep. And if you have a herd moving and they're trying to get away from obnoxious people, then the leaders will go up this kind of a draw, and if it ends in a head cut, then they're trapped. And the ones behind follow, and they serve as sort of a blocking system. So the ones at the head will begin to turn and mill. And if your hunters know, if you have a plan and you're cooperating, the obnoxious people start coming in with little chance of them being hurt or bothered, and the animals are simply trying to avoid them. The animals then will get stuck in a head cut of an arroyo like this, and if the hunters are hiding, say, behind sagebrush or whatever, laying on the ground, once the bison have stopped moving, then it's a fairly simple process to throw your spears, atlatl darts, arrows later in time, into animals that are literally standing still and may be no further away than I am from Drennan. It's about as close as I want to be to Drennan anyway. So the hunting of bison revolved around intimate knowledge of their behavior and of their responses to stimulus of various kinds. So one of the other key factors is that male and female bison are quite different physiologically on an annual cycle, and very different in size. So male bison will be half again, and sometimes almost twice as large as the females. Females will typically, the cow bison will typically quit growing after 2 years, certainly after 3. The male bison just keep growing. And that has to do with reproduction and calving and pregnancy. And so in a yearly cycle in the spring, after a winter of perhaps lean foraging, and if you're a cow bison, uh, very likely pregnant, and so by April and May, when calves are born, you begin nursing, and so cows are typically in poor physiological shape in the spring and early summer. And that's just because of pregnancy and raising the calves. Bulls, on the other hand, have had a pretty easy time of it, not being pregnant, not nursing, and not giving birth. So in the spring, the bulls are in better shape. And by fall, the cows have evened that out a bit if you have a good summer of foraging and grazing. And so by the rut, the mating season, September-ish, that period, the bulls kind of quit eating and do weird things and fight with each other and so forth over the good-looking cows. And so that period, we see the cows becoming in pretty good condition, and through the fall, the cows tend to be in better condition, better fat content, physiologically in better shape than the bulls. So if you're hunting bison and you know bison behavior and what goes on in bison life cycles, you hunt in different seasons in different ways, and you have different resources available in different seasons. Late fall, middle to late fall, the bone marrow and the fat content of bison are at their peak. By spring, they're and early summer, they tend to be at their poorest. So if you're after fat or marrow, you want to hunt bison in the late fall if you have that option. If you're after hides, and especially if you're after hides that you might use for teepees or shelter, then you can have a good hide without all the hair in late spring, early summer. If you want the hair on for robes and blankets and such, then you want a hide from the fall. So in other words, as suggested, not all bison are the same, and how you use bison resources will vary fairly substantially depending on your needs and season. I can already tell this is putting people to sleep. I'm going to try to wake up. Now this will put you to sleep for sure. Bison show up in the New World somewhere around 130 to maybe as early as 190,000 years ago. They spread throughout North America fairly quickly. This is our samples of old bison are relatively limited. In this period, bison operated not in large herds like we think of, but more as isolated foragers and browsers. Their dentition is essentially the same as that of deer and elk, and so they're geared and very capable browsers. And if we look at the plant contents on teeth, at places like Rancho La Brea, California, you see that most of what that group was eating was in fact forage and leaves and not grass. What happens with changing environmental conditions driving it, at the end of the Pleistocene, we lose a lot of the animals that were very common in what became the Great Plains region. So mammoths and camels and horses, musk oxen were more common than bison in places like Kansas and Wyoming 15,000 years ago than were bison. Sure. Yep. Yeah. Ground sloths really throughout the region, and so very large, but browsers, herbivores, not the cute little slow-moving guys that we think of today. So this is interesting timing. There's all kinds of archaeological and anthropological notions about the relationship between humans who have been in the New World. Most of us believe at least 20 or 30,000 years, but certainly the dramatically common evidence for people in the New World, it's pretty much everywhere by 13,000 years ago. So we know there are a lot of people, and we know some of the technologies developed in the New World, so they had to be here a while. And humans are watching this transition from the Pleistocene to the Holocene. They're watching is the wrong word. They're living through that with all the other creatures. So changes in resources and in populations of people and animals are happening fairly dramatically in terms of a few generations. So when these animals leave the scene, bison survive that, and largely because they're very gregarious, they're diverse foragers. They can eat just about anything. When the grasslands open up, because horses, camels, mammoths, they're designed dentitions for, designed in an evolutionary sense, dentitions for grass and eating grasses. Bison really aren't, but they're opportunists and they fill that niche. And bison populations really explode after about 13,000 years ago. And prior to that time, the bison that we see in the paleontological record are usually just one individual. You'll find a skeleton here or there, not large groups. After this time, we start seeing large kills of bison by humans. This continues, and so we're pedestrian bison hunters at this period. No ponies to ride yet, and so you're learning on foot how to behave around and work with and hunt and manage bison herds. This all changes pretty dramatically and pretty quickly after European contact. And a key driver to that change is the introduction of the horse. Coronado goofing around into Kansas, what became Kansas. He interacted with the Wichita, Apache people and others. Info from Pueblo folks. So there was already a lot of interaction between people living in the plains and the southwest, the southeast, by the time of European contact. One of the primary incentives for this contact early was trade. And by this is kind of a simplified version, but trade for hides and pelts and fur bearers, notably beaver, became very common and very important. And so Native people and people in Native nations living in the Great Plains region were trading actively by 1650 with multiple European nation traders. So they're part of a world system. They're part of this exchange and interaction. There's a fair bit, especially with the French, a fairly common pattern was for French traders to come spend years living and living with Native nations, peoples intermarrying with those people and providing a conduit for hides and furs going out, European goods coming in, metal tools, metal pots, beads, guns, axes, all those happy things that we enjoy out in the woods. 1680 was an interesting moment because it was at that point the Pueblo revolted against the Spanish domination, ran the Spanish out for almost a decade. And in that period, horse trading, which was kind of controlled as best they could prior to that, horses became abundant in the southern plains. It spread very rapidly, and horses become a key commodity of trade, interaction, status, wealth, whatever. After the U.S. buys the Louisiana Purchase, which included the Great Plains region, then we see considerable pressure increased on Native nations all throughout the eastern U.S., Great Lakes region, and in the southeast. And many of these groups are forced further west and then eventually moved further west purposefully. One of the opportunities that those groups had was to join in the hunting and trading of furs and pelts and hides. By about the 1820s, really, and certainly by the 1840s, beaver are pretty well trapped out of most of the easy access places. Trade's been going on for 200 years at a fairly significant rate. And the styles, beaver hats are becoming a little less important, and other needs, Eastern markets in the U.S., in America, are needing leather. And so the robe trade, bison hide trade, deer and elk and others as well, becomes a key component of lifeways. And this is a period that is pretty important, pretty pivotal here in terms of anthropological thinking about plains nations, and so we'll revisit that in a minute. So just notions of the Mammoth Steppe. As you get into the Americas, bison would have been a relatively minor or just a small piece of the critters who were around. Anthropologists then, by the 1890s, certainly starting earlier than that, and there are records and missionary records and observations of trappers and so forth. But anthropological thinking about the Great Plains really takes off in the 1880s, 1890s, and anthropologists have varied opinions. Sorry, that's kind of hard to read, but you don't need to read it. Kroeber was a Boas student, and many of his colleagues, Robert Lowy and others, also were, and wound up out at Berkeley with an early and important anthropology program. And Kroeber, whose plains work, he did a ethnography of the Arapaho and in the northern plains, and was very much involved in studies of people, native people in California as well. Anyway, he wrote this Cultural and Natural Areas of Native North America in the early 30s. There wasn't money to publish it, so it was nearly 10 years before it was published. But he stood by his argument that it wasn't feasible for native people to live in the Great Plains until European contact, because they needed the horse and they needed other resources, guns and such, but primarily the horse in order to survive in the plains. Whistler and others disagreed and saw the horse simply as an addition to a long-standing pattern of bison-focused economies of plains peoples. And that position is really came from and supported by Coronado's adventure in 1541, where they encounter and describe plains nomads hunting cows or cattle, bison, and living off them on a year-round basis and using dogs for transport. So that's sort of a tension in anthropology 100 years ago. And anthropologists documenting native nations in the Great Plains region recognize two broadly distinct groups: those who really did live in teepees pretty much year-round and were quite mobile and focused on bison hunting, but much of their economy also was focused on trading of horses and exchange of bison robes to European traders. The horticultural groups raising corn, beans, and squash, sunflowers, various peas and stuff, had a little different pattern, and the anthropologists studying these groups noted their interaction with the nomads, trading bison products and meat for vegetal foods and such, but also the importance of bison hunting to the horticulturalists, and that was for robes, for teepees when they were mobile out on the hunt, but also for hides to trade. What's, I think, perhaps most remarkable about the anthropological models, CMO, is that anthropologists from Kroeber, Lowy, Whistler, and on, and really Whistler not quite so bad, viewed native nations, peoples that they were studying and documenting as isolates, as primitive others, as separate from the rest of the world. So they were studying and writing about native peoples as if they had just discovered them, and those peoples had never encountered Europeans before. That clearly was not the case, and so we'll talk a little more about that in a minute. Anyway, so some thought that there really weren't people on the plains until after European contact, and others believed that they had been here a long time. And you can maybe read part of that, maybe not. Plains pedestrian bison hunters is just sort of a lot to spell out, so I tend to abbreviate it. So we're going to think about bison hunting. We know bison have been hunted by people for tens of thousands of years. Good examples of bison kills by spear using people and butchering and processing fairly commonly by 30 and 40,000 years ago, and going back well into what we would think of as Mousterian or Middle Stone Age time. And so some herds of bison, genetically a little different, more similar to blue babe or bison priscus than to our American bison, but closely related. So people come into the New World, whenever that is, any of those people that come in through the Bering route are potentially well aware of bison as a target for game. So we're being a little bit redundant here. This is an example from out by Lipscomb, Texas, in the Texas Panhandle, of just a large horned bison from the Waters Ranch, where the Lipscomb site and multiple other kills are. So big animals. But these animals were solitary. They were kind of self-defending, and they didn't live in herds. And one of the things that Dale Guthrie's research helped bring to light is how different bison became after the end of the Pleistocene, and they start filling this Great Plains grass niche, and so populations more or less explode, and behavior changes from isolated browsers who defend themselves and are kind of aggressive to herd behavior and foraging or grazing in grassland. So this is all kind of redundant to what we're getting ahead now, to what I've just said. So, the archaeological record starts to come to life really in the early 20th century. By the 1930s and 40s, we see multiple sites documented where people have killed and or scavenged and butchered late Pleistocene animals. So this is counter to Kroeber's idea that there were no people living in the Great Plains till after the introduction of the horse. But Kroeber saw that as a different environment, as was being argued and is true. The Great Plains that we know today is very different from that region at 13,000 years ago. So various researchers, folks in Nebraska and Wyoming and elsewhere, began to document the presence of people in deep time, thousands of years ago and a relatively continuous record of occupation. One of the interesting things that begins to develop is an understanding of bison as a focused or focal target for people living in the plains. And we see a few sites. These are Clovis age, 13,000 years and older, although Jake's Bluff is right on that cusp. And then later, Folsom age and Goshen and other typology doesn't matter for our purposes, but between Clovis time, about 13,000 years ago, and Folsom time, about 11 to 12,000 years ago, we see a dramatic increase in numbers of kill sites, the sizes of the kills, and this focus on bison happens really with Folsom. Prior to that, these are just, I have to apologize, I just spliced together various talks, some of which have relatively little relevance today, but Clovis material is widespread throughout the plains. Relatively, and many of these sites are associated with mammoth, even mastodon, if we're a little further east in Missouri, or the Great Lakes. The site of Murray Springs, Blackwater Draw, and Jake's Bluff, all are Clovis age sites with bison killed and butchered. We don't see that further north to any extent, but by Folsom time, bison kills occur from Montana to South Texas. And a whole variety of hunting strategies are used. We think of bison jumps. We're, with one possible exception, really don't see bison jumps in Folsom time. We see arroyo traps being used everywhere. So people have figured out how to convince bison to go into places they can't get out of, and then they take advantage of that. It's at this time that the environment has changed enough that if you were flying over or driving across or walking in the Great Plains region, it would look like the Great Plains. Still probably more trees, a little wetter, more playa lakes, but you would recognize the Great Plains. That really was not true in Clovis time. So we see in Folsom time what I would argue is the first true plains adaptation, because it's when the plains becomes the plains in an ecological and historical sense. The anthropologist and archaeologist have these notions. So the archaeologists are trained by the anthropologist, and so they go into the field expecting and thinking anthropologically, and the anthropologist taught us, very indoctrinated us into believing that you have campsites and kill sites, and you go out and you hunt bison, you bring back the proceeds, and so we should therefore expect these two distinct kinds of sites. This is an example of what you would not do, but National Geographic is great for imagination, and that's kind of what we're seeing there, was an artist's imagination. This would work a lot better if this guy was standing in a head cut arroyo and the spear chuckers were above and out of harm's way. Somebody there is going to get hurt, pretty sure. So we could expect in this early view, hunting, processing, transport, and then campsites. What comes to pass, though, especially research from folks like George Friesen, who was at the University of Wyoming, is that we see evidence for camping and right adjacent to kills or nearby kills with what George would call the natural refrigerator model. If you have a bison kill in the fall, um, that's a good thing. Your bugs and insects are down. You just camp out there and you use that resource through the winter, processing and gearing up as best um, as needed. So there are a number of sites where this pattern shows up. Agate Basin was a key one. There are a number of others, and that changes this anthropological model where you have early summer hunt after you plant the crops, and you have a fall hunt, and that was argued for by anthropologists who were studying people around 1900 based on their ethnographic presence. So one of the questions then is bison hunting the same from, we would say this is radiocarbon use, so you got to add about 1,000, 1,200 years to that. Did bison hunting change is sort of a question. Did it used to be very different than anthropologists have argued? There are strong elements of continuity. One of the interesting studies that Dennis Stanford did at the Jones Miller site in eastern Colorado was document a bison kill that resembled in many respects historically documented Cree or Northern Plains hunting system where you have a shaman and you have totems and offerings at a pole. In this case, included a bison skull. There was a eagle bone whistle, miniature projectiles, and post hole, which may have been where a shaman or leader stayed to draw in the animals. There are many bison kill sites that have evidence of ceremonial, religious, or ideologically important behaviors that go beyond killing and butchering bison. Offerings of various sorts, structures, and that's really a separate talk. But we have evidence of continuity. One example would be use of black-footed ferret as a medicine bundle container. We see that back to at least 9,000 years and into the historic period. So lots of elements of continuity. We'll just leave it at that. So we're going to race through some of this, from about 12,000 years ago to probably 2,000 years ago, we see a lot of elements of continuity, a lot of variation in bison populations, we think, a lot of variation in preservation because of periods of good moisture and periods of drought and erosion. So site preservation changes. One of the things that I've grown to be highly dubious of are the models that were offered in the early 20th century by anthropologists for Native nations people in terms of their economies, their patterns of behavior. Uh, these were usually taught and presented as if, um, as we mentioned, Native nations people were isolated from the rest of the world, which they clearly were not, as if their methods or lifestyles had not changed, which they clearly had. We don't see corn horticulture before 2,000 years ago, and it's an interesting transition. We see changes in terms of hunting behavior from atlatls, which is those of you that throw atlatls regularly know that you can't just be real quiet. You can't just do that. You got to put your body in it. The use of bows and arrows really changed options for hunters in terms of strategies. Knowledge of bison behavior, we start seeing bison jumps in abundance by about 4,000 years ago. Um, we see that potentially as early as 9,000, almost for sure by then, but it changes once we're using bows and arrows and depending on topography and herd behavior. So one of the things that I want you to be critical of in your reading about Plains Nation peoples who were bison hunters is do not view them as isolated and appreciate that the information that anthropologists were providing to us really was based on the early memories and trying to reconstruct pre-contact behaviors from elders. And this research was going on from the 1880s into the 1920s and after. That oral tradition and memory in terms of firsthand experiences certainly doesn't reach beyond the introduction of bows and arrows and agriculture, and almost certainly doesn't reach beyond the introduction of horses and intensive trade with Europeans and the heightened need for hides to trade. So having this trade link uh, between Europeans, Americans, and Native Nations people was a great incentive that changed the nature and intensity of bison hunting. Rather than hunting for uh, economic need, survival, we're hunting for trade, as hides as a commodity of exchange. I think that's where we're going to quit. But as we run out of time, and I don't like to bore you anymore, but I'll answer questions if I can answer them, and if there are any. That's good. There's no.
I'd forgotten that Bill Guthrie heard this in 2024, but that blue guy is on exhibit at the Museum of the North.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Quite a famous story that he wrote, focused on us.
Uh-huh.
Wonderful read. I recommend it. And it tells the story of a bison that was, what was that, 37,000?
Right at 30. I didn't remember if it was 27 or 37, but yeah.
Before people understood how it was living and then how it was found, kind of a sample of alien culture. So it's such a wonderful storyteller.
Yes, and that is it's a marvelous read, and it actually um, opens up how important looking at deep time is for understanding the evolution and behavior of bison as we think of them, because that's changed dramatically since Blue Babe days. Yeah, Jim.
Buffalo jumps, they just herd them over into a cliff.
Yeah, and that takes a really coordinated effort, and it takes a real distinctive landscape. Um, so so what usually enables that, we'll have drive lines, something, and it often would just be um, piles of brush or stone monuments, sometimes with um, a flag of some sort, whether it's hair or hide, uh, so that you can start in kind of like a fish weir, you funnel from a large area into a specific concentrated uh, location. Usually this will be a run slightly uphill, and what's important is that the bison don't see the drop off. And so most jumps that are large or successful, if you stand, say, 30 yards back from the edge, it just yeah, it looks like it's continuous. And so by the time the animals at the front realize that they need to turn, all the animals behind are pushing them, and they just can't. So you have to get them moving, and that requires kind of a coordinated effort, uh, but it has to have some kind of constraint to keep them from turning. So a lot of those, um, that kind of coordinated effort we see really explode in terms of frequency about 4,000 years ago. It became a common. Yes. Yeah, yeah. Head smashed in, and Alberta is a famous one.
Buffalo bones, that was quite a market for them right after.
Yes, it really all ended with the white buffalo hunters, and so you get tens of thousands killed annually, uh, and so all the bones were scattered across the plains. When when settlement, um, homesteading happened, many of those people were not very adept farmers, didn't really know much about what they were up to, and most of them had very little money. And so one of the common ways to survive your first year or two on a homestead was to collect all these bones, especially in some areas like around salt marshes, playa lakes, but just anywhere there had been a kill, um, collect those up by the wagon load and sell them for the uh, fertilizer market. So train loads of bones got shipped back east. Yeah, and so those would um, literally tons and tons of bones were picked up and hauled away, and that would give a little cash to the homesteaders to survive the early years of building a homestead. The the record was really dramatically impacted by that, and so it was lucrative enough that in some cases people would dig up old bison kills or bone beds for the bones and ship them. But most of that was just picked up on the surface. And that's why the evidence kind of vaporized.
So when they would drive a bunch of bison to the hills to kill them, were they able to use all the meat? Did they have a way to preserve all that meat if they killed so much at once? I mean, did it go to waste or did they use it or what?
The popular idea is that they used every blade, every hair and every hoof. The reality is that when we excavate mass kills where you have 30 or more animals, that really, whether they all get used and how they get used, depends largely on the season and how many people involved in the group and whether they have to transport them. It's real common to find unbutchered carcasses or partially butchered, but they weren't always after the meat. So you've got to have calf or young, hides for some clothing and containers, and you've got to have hides for teepees and shelter, and then certainly by the late 1600s you're getting hides to trade. So you may not be killing for the meat, and we see a lot of variation in the intensity of butchering. So like late fall, if you're going to process, bison are lean, so you see a lot of athletes and others that have like a high protein diet will like bison. But you can't live on lean meat forever. You've got to have carbohydrates or fats to metabolize the protein. So what normally was done was to butcher as many as you could, dry that meat, and render the fat, collect the marrow, process the long bones, cancellous ends of bones, boil that, get the fat off of that, combine then the fats and dried meat, usually the dried meat being pounded so it was easy to chew. If you had it, you would add in hackberries or plums or whatever kind of fruit, and then curate that in what was called pemmican, and that was an important trade commodity as well. Travelers, trappers, traders, they needed to eat, they needed horses. The native nations people had horses, they would trade for European goods, they had food, they'd trade likewise, but especially pelts and hides, because that's what the traders were after. So it's real common, even in ancient sites, to see animals not fully butchered or not fully processed. If you have a kill that's late spring, early summer, you're not going to render the bones for fat. There's no fat in them. It's not worth the trouble. The marrow is in poor condition. You're not going to crack the bones and eat the marrow. You do that in the fall. So you see real different patterns of how the animals are used and processed depending on the need and the season. And do you have to transport all this? Do you have horses? You got a bunch of healthy teenage kids, you got dogs. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So they were making normal, sane decisions. They're not going to process stuff they don't have to have. One of the other problems with summer and warm weather kills are just the insects and the flies and the rot. So you can camp pretty close, but you're going to camp upwind, and you're going to give it a little room. Winter is a whole different thing. Camp right next to the carcasses.
All right, I think we're good. More questions?
Thank you all. Appreciate it.